Welcome to Topic 2, the Puritans of New England. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to describe the Puritans and explain why they migrated to New England during the first half of the 17th century, and to identify which characteristics of their culture and of New England helped them achieve success. You should take notes during this podcast, pause it as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to. This podcast is also considered a secondary source. During our next in-class activity, we will analyze a primary source, a gravestone, related to the Puritans. The following podcast will discuss how to take notes on a secondary source reading, which happens to deal in part with the Puritans. During the following class, we will learn how to synthesize your notes from this podcast, your notes on the gravestone, and your notes from the reading. Therefore, it's essential that you take notes on this podcast in order to be able to complete a future graded assignment. First, let's take a look at where New England is located. You can see that New England rests in the northeasternmost corner of the present United States. It comprises the present-day states of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. However, during the colonial period, the territory inside present-day Maine and Vermont belonged to other colonies. The Puritans who migrated to New England between 1620 and 1640 comprised the core group of settlers from which most New Englanders up through the Revolution descended. The Puritans fled England and established Massachusetts Bay Colony as a result of religious persecution, but ironically did not permit religious freedom within Massachusetts. To understand their motives, we need to enter briefly into the world of their great-grandparents' 16th century Europe. In 1517, a Roman Catholic monk named Martin Luther tried to reform the Catholic Church of what he saw as its corrupt practices. Luther and his followers thought the Church gave too much power to priests. The Catholic Church hierarchy did not reform in the ways that Luther desired, so his reform movement became known as the Protestant Reformation and kicked off a flurry of religious activity during which many new sects or denominations were formed. Examples of different Protestant denominations are Lutheranism, Methodist, and Baptists. One of Luther's key ideas was that individual people could establish their own personal relationship with God by reading the Bible themselves and by not relying on a Catholic priest to interpret it for them. This emphasis on individualism prompted several throughout Northern and Central Europe to form their own churches. One of those individuals was King Henry VIII of England. Henry desired a male heir, but his current wife was not conceiving any boys. Though he wanted to marry someone else to improve his chances of fathering a son, divorce is considered a sin in the Catholic Church. Therefore, Henry founded his own church called the Church of England, placed himself at its head, and granted himself a divorce. Followers of the Church of England are called Anglicans in England, and their adherents in North America would become known as Episcopalians. This is the religion of the people who founded Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. Unfortunately, Henry's religious conversion set off decades of religious animosity between those who remained Catholic and others who converted to Anglicanism. Still others maintain that Anglicanism did not go far enough in ridding itself of the excesses and corruption of Catholicism. These people wanted to purify the Church of England and so were called Puritans. Others felt that the Church of England was beyond purification, so they sought to separate from it. These folks were thus called separatists. First, they separated from their old homes in England to establish a small community in the town of Scrooby. But when local inhabitants began to persecute them there, the separatists eventually relocated to religiously tolerant Holland. However, when their children began to adopt Dutch customs there, these Englishmen sought a new location where they could worship God as they pleased and bring up their children as Englishmen. Eventually, they settled on the New World. These religiously motivated journeys earned them the name of pilgrims, the name for anyone who makes a trip in the name of religion. Our pilgrims sailed on board the ship Mayflower and arrived in the place they called Plymouth, after the town where they lived in southern England, in November 1620. Eventually, the Pilgrims were absorbed into the much larger community of Puritans who settled in Boston in 1630. The colony they established was known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony, in the heart of the region they would call New England. The Puritans' religious beliefs profoundly influenced the social, political, and economic structures and practices of 17th century New England. While the Puritans believed in predestination, that God had determined at the start of time whose soul would be saved and whose would be damned, they also believed that consistent hard work was an outward sign that one was predestined for heaven. They also believed that spending money wastefully was a sign that one's soul was destined for hell. Therefore, these hard workers dedicated themselves to their work and often invested any profits back into their small businesses and farms. While the religious motivation behind these practices waned by the 18th century, the habits of hard work and reinvestment of profits resulted in what the 20th century sociologist Max Weber called the Protestant work ethic. This Protestant work ethic was an important factor behind the Puritans' establishment of a successful colony in New England during the 17th century. Equally important, back in England, the Puritans came from middle-class backgrounds used to having to work hard to get ahead. Unlike the aristocratic migrants to the Chesapeake, the Puritans were not members of the landed gentry. Rather, most of them possessed skills that would be useful in starting a new society. Whereas the Chesapeake wound up becoming a colony dedicated to large-scale cultivation of tobacco, New England's economy was remarkably diverse. Cod and timber from the forests and sea were mined for their economic benefits, and artisans began small businesses needed for the functioning of a new colony. Soap and candle makers, shoemakers, tanners, blacksmiths, and the like were all among the middling sort who formed the core of colonial New England society. The Puritans' diverse skills, as well as their remarkable work ethic, played important roles in their ability to found a colony that flourished. Likewise, New England itself offered a prime location for the hard-working Puritans' colony. Long, cold winters and rocky soil made it difficult to establish large-scale plantation agriculture, as did their fellow Englishmen further south in the Chesapeake. Nevertheless, the short summers meant that disease did not proliferate as quickly or as widely as it would in Virginia. Therefore, more Puritans survived the first difficult years of colonization than did their Anglican neighbors to the south. And while today the word Puritan, with a small p, connotes a prudish attitude towards sex, the 17th century Puritans enjoyed robust relations in that regard. They had migrated to America as family units and valued a strong family unit with the father as the head of the family, as they viewed God the head of his family of believers. The cold, healthful climate allowed the Puritans' large families to survive and proliferate beyond Massachusetts Bay, south and west into the Connecticut River Valley, and north into what is today New Hampshire. This rapid spread brought them into quick conflict with the existing residents of these areas, the Native Americans. We will explore colonist conflicts with Native Americans in a later podcast. In spite of these conflicts, the Puritans were able to experience demographic success in 17th century New England, as this map shows, thanks to the region's climate and their own tight-knit family and social structures. In conclusion, it was a combination of religious, social, economic, and geographic factors that went into making 17th century New England a stable and prosperous colony. The combination of who the Puritans were, hardworking, tight-knit families, highly ordered social structure, intolerant of religious dissent, and what New England offered, a cold climate which prevented the spread of disease, and a variety of natural resources from which they could make their living, enabled the Puritans to create a colony that was socially and economically successful during the 17th century.